Before the sun rose, he was already awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the fan creak like it might give up before he did. The day always began this way, with quiet calculations. How much rice was left? How long the gas cylinder would last? Whether today he could pretend not to notice the overdue notice folded inside his pocket. He moved slowly, not because he was lazy, but because rushing only reminded him of how little control he had. The world outside waited without sympathy, and he met it every morning with the same tired resolve. He washed his face in cold water, flinching at the shock, then checked on his son sleeping on the thin mattress beside the wall. The boy's chest rose and fell peacefully, unaware of the numbers that haunted his father's thoughts. That small, steady breath was the reason he kept going. Breakfast was simple. Lunch would be uncertain. Dinner would depend on luck. He packed what he could, kissed the boy's forehead, and whispered a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Work was loud, unforgiving, and temporary. The kind of job where effort was invisible and mistakes were remembered forever. He carried loads heavier than his own worries, his hands rough, his back aching, his mind constantly racing ahead to the next bill, the next sacrifice. Around him, others complained loudly, but he saved his energy. Complaints didn't feed children. Silence, somehow, felt more responsible. By evening, exhaustion clung to him like dust. He walked home past bright shops and polished cars, places that felt like another country. He never stopped to look long. Wanting was dangerous when survival was fragile. Yet even with empty pockets and a full heart of worry, something stubborn remained inside him. A belief, quiet but firm, that decency mattered, even when no one was watching. He counted steps instead of dreams, measuring life in distances between paydays. Each night he folded worry away so his son would never see it. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford, but dignity was not negotiable. Even when the world treated him as invisible, he chose patience over bitterness, honesty over shortcuts, kindness over resentment, because some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Survival meant guarding the last good things inside. That belief would soon be tested on an ordinary day that would quietly stop being ordinary at all. Morning after morning, he stood in lines that never seemed to move, clutching worn papers that proved he existed on record, if nowhere else. Offices smelled of dust and impatience. Clerks barely looked up, their eyes sliding past him as if he were part of the furniture. Forms were stamped, rejected, restamped, and handed back with rehearsed apologies that carried no weight. Come back tomorrow. Try somewhere else. There was always another door, and it was always closed. He searched for work the way some people searched for mercy. Each day meant new faces, new promises, and the same quiet dismissal. Employers smiled thinly, glanced at his age, his clothes, his tired eyes, then said they would call. They never did. Younger men were cheaper. Louder men were noticed. He learned that honesty didn't impress anyone, and patience was mistaken for weakness. By afternoon, rejection sat heavier than hunger. On the bus ride home, advertisements flashed across polished screens. Smiling families, easy loans. Words like opportunity and success glowing in colors he could no longer imagine touching. He watched others scroll on phones worth more than his monthly pay once was. No one looked at him. He was present but unseen, breathing among people who had already decided he didn't matter. Even the places meant to help felt distant. Charity offices asked questions he had no clean answers for. Shelters were full. Assistance required documents he had lost years ago, buried under moves he never chose. Every system demanded proof of stability from a man drowning in instability. He nodded, thanked them politely, and left with pamphlets instead of solutions. Asking for help felt like shrinking, inch by inch. At home, he hid the truth behind routine. He listened more than he spoke, afraid that too many words would reveal the cracks. His son talked about school, about small dreams, about things that still felt possible. The father smiled and agreed, carrying guilt like a second spine. He wondered how long he could protect that innocence before reality forced its way inside. Late at night, when the city finally quieted, doubt crept in. Not loud doubt, but the dangerous kind that whispered maybe he really was invisible. Maybe effort didn't matter. Maybe decency was a mistake. He pushed those thoughts away, clinging to stubborn pride and fragile hope, because if he stopped believing he mattered, even a little, there would be nothing left to give. He didn't know it yet, but being unseen was about to place him at the center of a moment that would change everything. Tomorrow would begin like all the others, or so he believed. Another walk, another search, another silent refusal. Yet somewhere ahead, hidden inside an ordinary street and an ordinary choice, waited a crossing point he could not avoid, where his quiet existence would collide with someone else's fate, and the world would finally be forced to look at him for the first time. The street was louder than usual, engines growling, horns snapping, impatience hanging thick in the air. He was halfway through the intersection when he noticed her standing still at the curb, her white cane angled uncertainly, her head slightly tilted as if listening for permission to move. Cars rushed past inches from her shoes. People brushed by her shoulder, annoyed, inconvenienced, unwilling to slow down. She existed in the center of motion, yet completely alone. He stopped without thinking. The habit of keeping his head down broke for just a moment. Up close, she looked older than he first assumed, her eyes clouded yet calm, her posture careful but dignified. She wore clean clothes, modest and simple, and held herself as someone used to managing without help. The light changed again, and still no one paused. A man sighed loudly behind her. A woman muttered under her breath. The world had decided she was an obstacle. "Do you need help crossing?" he asked quietly, unsure if she could sense his presence. She turned toward his voice and smiled, a small relieved smile that carried more gratitude than words ever could. She nodded once. He offered his arm, hesitant, respectful, letting her choose. When she accepted, her grip was light but trusting, as if this small gesture carried great risk. They stepped forward together. Traffic surged, then slowed. Each step felt deliberate, measured, as though time itself had agreed to wait. He guided her gently, describing the curb, the uneven pavement, the final step onto safety. Around them, the city exhaled and rushed on, uninterested in the quiet act unfolding in its middle. No one thanked him. No one noticed. On the other side, she paused instead of letting go. "People forget," she said softly, her voice steady, without bitterness. "Not because they're cruel, because they're busy." He didn't know what to say. He nodded, embarrassed by how true it sounded. She asked his name. He gave it reluctantly, unused to being remembered. She introduced herself only as someone passing through. Before leaving, she pressed something into his hand. He tried to refuse, explaining he had done nothing special. She insisted gently. When she walked away, counting steps with her cane, he finally looked down. It was a folded bill, more than he would earn in hours. His chest tightened with conflicting emotions. Pride, shame, confusion, gratitude tangled together. He stood there long after she disappeared into the crowd, staring at the crossing he had walked 1,000 times before. Helping her had cost him nothing, yet it felt heavier than anything he carried all day. As he closed his fingers around the bill, a strange thought surfaced. That woman hadn't felt ordinary at all. And somehow, without knowing why, he sensed their meeting was not finished yet. He did not realize this quiet crossing had just shifted unseen pieces into motion, setting consequences that would soon return to him multiplied back. He walked beside her only as long as she needed, no farther. When they reached the quieter stretch of sidewalk, he slowed, ready to let go. She thanked him again, her voice warm, searching his face in a way that felt more attentive than sight. He shook his head, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same," he said, even though they both knew it wasn't true. She tried to press the money back into his hand. He closed her fingers gently and refused, his tone firm but kind. He did not explain his reasons. He did not mention his son, his bills, his worries. He understood something instinctively. Turning kindness into a transaction would break it. She hesitated, then smiled, as if she respected him more for saying no. That smile lingered longer than necessary, thoughtful, curious, as if she were memorizing him without eyes. They spoke only briefly. She asked about the street ahead. He described it carefully, counting steps, pointing out obstacles she would never see. He did not rush, though time mattered to him more than most. Each word was chosen with care, not because he was eloquent, but because he wanted her to feel safe. When she was ready, he stepped back. There was no farewell speech, no lingering pause, just a quiet ending. As he turned away, no one clapped, no phone recorded the moment. The crowd swallowed it instantly. To the world, nothing of value had happened. He resumed his walk, the rhythm of his day closing around him again. Hunger returned. Worry followed. The city remained indifferent, yet something subtle had shifted. His steps felt lighter, not because his problems were gone, but because, for a moment, they had not defined him. Helping her had reminded him that he was more than what he lacked, that even unnoticed goodness carried weight. He did not dwell on it. Reflection was a luxury. Survival demanded forward motion. At home, his son asked how his day went. He answered with a simple fine, and meant it more than usual. He cooked a small meal, stretching it carefully, pretending not to notice his own portion shrinking. Later, as the boy slept, he sat in the dim room and listened to the city breathe. The encounter replayed quietly in his mind, not as pride, but as calm. Somewhere, the blind woman was continuing her journey, counting steps, navigating the same world differently. He did not expect to see her again. Kindness to him was not a seed planted for reward. It was simply the right thing, done once, then released. What he could not know was that silence does not mean absence, that moments without witnesses sometimes echo the loudest later, and that his refusal to take credit, his choice to disappear back into ordinary life, had marked him more clearly than he realized. The story he believed was finished had only just begun, quietly waiting to return to him when he least expected it. The very next morning, the small sense of calm he carried was stripped away without warning. He arrived at work to find the gate locked and a notice taped crookly to the metal. Downsizing, temporary closure, no explanations, no apologies, just a number to call that no one answered. Men stood around him in silence, reading the same words, already calculating losses. He felt the ground shift beneath his feet, that familiar drop in the stomach when stability reveals itself as an illusion. He walked home slower than usual, replaying numbers in his head. Rent was due, school fees were waiting. The little cushion he had saved was barely enough for a week. By the time he reached his street, another blow was waiting. His son met him at the door, eyes wide, holding a crumpled note from school. A payment deadline. Mandatory. No exceptions. He read it twice, hoping the words would change. That night, sleep refused to come. He lay awake listening to his son's breathing, every rise and fall tightening his chest. He wondered, not for the first time, if doing the right thing made life harder. He had given away time, effort, even refused money he needed. And now the world seemed to answer with punishment, as if kindness were a debt he could not afford. The days that followed were heavy. He sold what little he could, quietly, piece by piece. A tool here, an old jacket there. He skipped meals without announcing it. He stood in new lines, filled new forms, heard the same tired phrases. We'll call you. Check back next week. Nothing changed. Good intentions did not pay bills. Decency did not negotiate deadlines. His son noticed the tension, the pauses between answers, the way his father stared too long at nothing. One evening, the boy asked softly if everything was okay. He smiled and said yes, hating the lie but loving the reason. That smile cost him more than any unpaid bill. Anger tried to rise, but he pushed it down. The world owed him nothing, he told himself. Still, doubt crept in again, sharper this time. Maybe goodness was naive. Maybe survival required harder choices. The thought scared him more than poverty ever had. On the fourth day, as he prepared to leave the apartment with no clear destination, a knock echoed through the thin walls. Unexpected. Firm. He froze, heart racing, wondering who could possibly be looking for him now. The knock came again, heavier, carrying a sense of purpose that did not belong in his fragile life. Whatever waited on the other side of that door was about to change the direction of everything, for better or for worse, and he had no way of knowing which. He took a breath, reached for the handle, and prepared to face another judgment from a world that had never shown mercy, unaware this knock carried a different truth inside him. The woman returned to a home far quieter than the streets she crossed. The door closed softly behind her, sealing away the noise, the impatience, the careless voices. Inside, space unfolded differently, mapped by memory rather than sight. Every step was measured. Every object knew its place. The stillness did not feel empty, but it carried weight, like a room that had once been full and learned to stay silent. She removed her coat and traced the edge of a long table with practiced fingers. The wood was polished, expensive, cared for by hands that were not hers. The apartment was large, though she never referred to it that way. Size meant nothing when rooms echoed. Somewhere beyond the walls, a city glittered with wealth and ambition. But here, loneliness sat comfortably, familiar as an old ache. Her phone rang, its tone distinct. She listened as a voice spoke formally, updating her on matters she never discussed in public. Numbers were mentioned, names too. She asked precise questions, her tone calm, authoritative, utterly different from the gentle uncertainty she carried on the street. When the call ended, she sat for a long moment, fingers resting on the cane beside her, as if grounding herself between two versions of the same life. Once, she had been surrounded by people who saw her clearly. Advisors, employees, family who spoke loudly and expected obedience. Power had followed her everywhere, heavy and demanding, until it vanished in a single moment that took more than her sight. Loss had taught her how quickly admiration disappeared when usefulness faded. The world had not slowed for her grief. It had simply stepped around it. No, she moved through days unnoticed by choice. She dressed simply. She walked alone. She learned who people were when they believed no one important was watching. Most hurried past. Some offered shallow help, loud and impatient. Few spoke to her as a person. Fewer still listened. That was why the man at the crossing lingered in her thoughts. He had not asked questions that satisfied curiosity. He had not spoken down to her or filled the silence with unnecessary reassurance. He had offered his arm and waited. He had described the street with care, as if her safety mattered. When she offered money, he refused without pride or performance. That refusal unsettled her more than generosity ever could. She replayed his voice in her mind, not the words, but the steadiness behind them. There was no hunger in it, no expectation, just presence. In a lifetime shaped by transactions, that absence felt rare, almost suspicious. She wondered about his life, imagined burdens he did not reveal. She wondered how someone carrying so little could afford such quiet dignity. Later, she opened a drawer and touched objects she rarely revisited. Documents, letters, a photograph traced by memory rather than sight, evidence of a world that still answered to her name. Influence waited patiently, unused, like a muscle left idle. She had promised herself never to wield it for sentiment or impulse. Yet as night settled, her thoughts returned to an ordinary man standing at a crossing, invisible to everyone but her. Fate, she believed, was not dramatic. It was precise. It placed people together briefly, then waited to see what they chose. Somewhere in the city, that man was struggling through another night, unaware that he had crossed into her world without knowing it, and that the distance between them was already beginning to close, slowly, deliberately, toward a moment neither of them could stop. The conference hall buzzed with polite murmurs, the kind that accompany routine announcements, board meetings, and presentations meant to impress without inspiring. Papers shuffled, phones were checked, someone cleared their throat. The blind woman sat quietly at the edge of the room, listening, absorbing, her presence barely noticed by the executives preoccupied with power in a different language, the language of status, contracts, and profit. Then he arrived. Without warning, the air shifted immediately. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Chairs scraped against polished floors. A tall figure entered, dressed simply but impeccably, radiating an authority that needed no explanation. He did not nod or smile, and yet everyone instinctively froze. The buzz of modern life stopped, replaced by a weighty silence that demanded attention. Even the most confident executives felt their composure slip. He moved toward the front, his eyes scanning the room with precision. No one interrupted. No one dared. It was a presence that was both sudden and inevitable, as though the room had been waiting for this interruption without knowing it. His reputation preceded him, wealth unmeasured, influence unquestioned, decisions that could topple empires. He paused near the blind woman, and the faintest recognition flickered in her expression, subtle, careful, unreadable. He spoke softly, almost casually, yet every word carried gravity. "Stop," he said, and the single syllable ricocheted through the hall, halting presentations mid-slide, silencing debates that had been rehearsed for days. Everyone held their breath. The world outside the room, the street, the city, the usual chaos could have gone on without notice, but here, under his gaze, time slowed. People felt a collective awareness that something beyond understanding had entered their lives. The blind woman's fingers twitched slightly. She did not flinch, but she recognized the cadence. The tone that suggested decisions made long ago were now converging with this moment. He waited only a heartbeat longer, letting the silence stretch, and then turned his gaze toward the assistants, the secretaries, the nervous staff. Instructions were given, brief, precise, and final. Tasks that had seemed urgent yesterday were canceled. Contracts were paused. Meetings postponed. The ripple was immediate, palpable, unsettling. Rumors swirled without being spoken. Who was this man? Why had he chosen to appear here now? Whispers clashed with the sound of the blank projector screen, the halted slides, the collective pulse of startled executives. Yet to her, it felt intimate, almost familiar. There was history in the way he lingered, subtle traces of connection that no one else could see. A world of influence hidden in a single glance, meant only for her, and for reasons she refused to reveal. As he finally stepped back, the hall exhaled, though none could entirely shake the tension. Lives that had been racing forward were paused, if only briefly. The billionaire moved with deliberate calm, leaving questions heavier than answers. And in that silence, in the space he left behind, the audience could sense the scale of what was coming, an intersection between invisible struggle and unimaginable power, waiting to collide in ways that would test the limits of decency, fortune, and fate. Even as he disappeared from view, the faint echo of authority lingered, a promise and a warning. The ordinary man in the city, unaware of this sudden shift, could not yet imagine the force now in motion, or how soon it would touch his life. The room was quiet again, though for entirely different reasons than before. The billionaire, usually untouchable, leaned forward slightly, his gaze focused on the blind woman in a way that commanded attention without demanding it. He spoke her name, clear, resonant, and the syllables carried history, authority, and respect. Gasps rippled across the hall. Executives, assistants, and staff who had once dismissed her as invisible now realized the magnitude of her presence. She was not merely a woman navigating the streets. She was the heir to a legacy, a figure whose decisions could shift fortunes, a person whose influence had been hidden in plain sight. The blind woman, calm and deliberate, raised her hand and revealed the folded papers she had carried in her bag. Contracts, assets, directives, documents that, until this moment, had remained secret, untouched, and nearly forgotten. She had orchestrated this intervention without spectacle, without ego, relying instead on timing, observation, and the quiet judgment of someone who understood human decency. The billionaire's acknowledgement amplified her authority, demonstrating that power could be wielded without cruelty, that visibility did not require showmanship. Meanwhile, the father, the man who had offered help without expectation, stood quietly at the edge, his mind still piecing together the extraordinary circumstances. The folded bill he had refused days earlier seemed insignificant now compared to the attention focused on a woman he had assisted. A subtle nod from her, almost imperceptible, directed the billionaire's attention toward him. The hall fell silent again. Eyes that had once skimmed past him now searched, recognizing him, understanding without explanation. She spoke then, her voice soft but unshakable. She recounted the moment at the crossing, emphasizing that his kindness had been genuine, unobserved, and transformative in ways that money or influence could never replicate. The words washed over the room, contrasting sharply with the polished power that had paused the world moments ago. The executive shifted uneasily, confronted with the realization that the simplest, quietest action, a man helping a stranger, carried more meaning than the deals, ambitions, and displays that had occupied their lives. The billionaire rose, extending a hand to the father, not as an employer, but as a witness to honor. "This man," he said, "showed a generosity the world has forgotten how to value. He has earned recognition, not by wealth, but by humanity." The hall erupted in murmurs, some tentative applause, the sound of invisible deeds finally receiving their due. For the first time, the father's burdens felt lighter, the invisible weight of hardship replaced by acknowledgement that mattered far beyond bills, hunger, or exhaustion. In that room, the scales of life seemed to tilt, not arbitrarily, but with precise moral clarity. Humiliation transformed into honor. Invisibility became recognition. A small act of kindness, offered without cameras or expectation, had intersected with wealth and power in a way that affirmed a timeless truth. Integrity and decency, even unnoticed, never go unrewarded. The father's eyes met the blind woman's once more. No words were needed. The connection between them, the intersection of ordinary humanity and extraordinary influence, had shifted the trajectory of more than just one life. Justice, subtle and cinematic, had arrived. And though the world outside remained unchanged, inside that hall, a quiet, emotional reckoning unfolded, leaving every witness, visible or not, to understand the enduring power of compassion and the unshakable truth that the smallest acts can spark the greatest transformations. The father did not expect the knock on his door to change everything. But when it came, it carried no fanfare, no announcement, no cameras, only presence. A driver waited outside to escort him, and a letter lay neatly on his table. It was not charity, it was opportunity. A modest apartment lease renewed, a steady job lined up, and an account credited with funds enough to cover months of bills. Dignity remained intact because nothing was offered as pity. Every detail respected his self-reliance, his quiet strength, and the life he had fought to maintain. The billionaire watched from a distance, studying the men who had acted without reward or recognition. He noted how effort and integrity had gone unnoticed for years, and yet here they were finally intersecting with influence in a way that felt neither manipulative nor arbitrary. He realized that wealth alone could not measure character. It could only amplify it when guided by awareness and patience. Humanity, he understood, was not about spectacle but about subtle acknowledgement. When the father arrived at the new workplace, he found colleagues polite, professional, yet unaware of the story behind him. He smiled quietly, feeling a relief unfamiliar in its steadiness. Stability wrapped around him like an old friend, not intrusive, not demanding. Bills could be paid. Meals could be predictable. His son's future no longer hung in the fragile balance of luck and misfortune. For the first time in years, worry receded enough to allow a breath that was not tinged with fear. Even the apartment felt different. Rooms that had once seemed small now offered quiet space to rebuild, not just survive. He unpacked belongings methodically, placing objects where they belonged, and felt satisfaction in small accomplishments, simple victories that no one would notice but him. The past hardship had not vanished, nor should it. It had shaped him, honed patience, humility, and resilience, but the future now carried promise instead of threat. The blind woman and the billionaire observed quietly, each understanding the other's role in this delicate orchestration. Neither had forced change. Both had respected agency, timing, and moral balance. Poetic justice had arrived not as spectacle, but as alignment, kindness recognized, character honored, and dignity restored. No applause was needed. No social media acknowledgement would capture it. The lesson lingered quietly in the air. The smallest acts, carried out with courage and integrity, could ripple into monumental change. That evening, as father and son shared a modest meal together, neither could speak fully of the days that had passed or the lives quietly shifted. Yet in the shared glance, the silent understanding was unmistakable. The world, sometimes indifferent, had now acknowledged the worth of goodness. And somewhere beyond the city, unseen yet present, two people smiled knowingly, having witnessed how life could tilt toward justice when morality and patience converged. Morning light filtered through the small apartment window, soft and unhurried, touching the worn table where father and son sat sharing breakfast. There were no lavish spreads, no distractions, only simple food and the warmth of a routine that no longer carried the constant edge of worry. Silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding, a recognition that life had shifted quietly but irrevocably. The father watched his son laugh over a small triumph, a completed homework problem, a spoonful of cereal spilled and recovered, and felt relief that was almost foreign in its steadiness. He understood that survival had been transformed into stability, struggle replaced by dignity, and that this new normal, humble as it was, carried more meaning than any fleeting wealth or recognition could offer. Somewhere in the city, the blind woman moved through her life as she always had, quiet, deliberate, unobserved by most, yet profoundly influential. Her presence lingered like a shadow of guidance, proof that the smallest acts of human decency could ripple farther than the loudest declarations of power. She had altered more than circumstance. She had reshaped perspective, teaching that kindness, even unseen, echoes endlessly. The father placed a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the weight of gratitude and hope simultaneously. The city hummed beyond the walls, indifferent yet full of possibility. And in that ordinary apartment, a life had been restored not by grandeur or spectacle, but by simple, courageous humanity. As the day began, the father stepped outside briefly, looking toward the street where once he had encountered her, smiling quietly to himself. The lesson lingered, unspoken but clear. Goodness matters, invisibly, persistently, and in ways that eventually return, not always as reward, but as quiet transformation.